this is also one of the quite striking or arresting propositions of the book, which is that rape culture has been or is instrumental to functioning economies. That's what you argue. What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, when we talk about rape culture, which obviously, again, a lot of this book is slightly, maybe it's 102. It's not 101, it's 102, something like that. But a lot of this book explains stuff to some people who may already know, but just in case you don't, rape culture isn't a culture in which rape is common. It's a culture in which rape is normalized and accepted. And I know it can feel quite controversial to say rape is accepted in this society, but if you look at the figures for how many violent sexual assaults and rapes actually result in a conviction, even of those that are brought to the police at all, you will see that rape is functionally legal in a lot of the global north, a lot of countries. And people know that in many cases, it's not worth bringing a rape case to trial. The justice system has really no answer for violence against women, and in particular for sexual violence against women and children. And what that does, it's not simply about sex. It's also about sex, but it's not just about sex. What rape culture does is it functions as a form of discipline. It controls the behavior of women and girls and children. It says that it is your responsibility to guard against rape. Rape could happen to you at any time. And it asks women and girls to behave as if any man is a potential rapist. The idea that all men are rapists didn't come from feminism. It came from patriarchy. Except feminists were the first people to name it. And that, again, side note, a lot of conservative culture right now is made up of people who are just incredibly angry at hearing themselves accurately described. And I don't know. But rape culture as a disciplinary function means it controls women's behavior. It controls the behavior of girls and people of all different genders. And it's part of a system whereby women's behavior and women's sexuality is instrumentalized as a form of economic dependence on men, if that makes sense. I believe that was a complete sentence. And if so, I'm pretty proud of myself.
It was. You're doing really well. And the hard questions are going to keep coming, but only because this is such an interesting conversation. One of the arguments you make in the book is that to change the culture of consent, we have to move from talking about rules, or maybe the kind of discipline you were talking about rules, and to instead start talking about ethics. What does ethics mean here? What does it look like? Who establishes these ethics?
Well, that's now a question with a more complicated answer, partly because I don't know what you did in the pandemic and the sort of like alone in pandemic times. I had a good few months, but I listened to a lot of podcasts about political philosophy and the definition of ethics. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I spent a lot of time down there. But in the book, when I'm talking about rules versus ethics, I'm talking about rules as a set of instructions for how to behave, and ethics as a set of principles. So if the rule is, for example, you always hold the door for somebody else rather than slamming it in their face, the principle is other people matter, and just because you got somewhere ahead of them doesn't mean you should slam a door in their face. And if the rules, so when that applies to consent, right? People, especially around the beginning of the Me Too movement, but still people ask me, like, what do I do? How do I make sure my partner is fully consenting? And there've been all these mad sort of ideas, like, an app where you can sign something and it's blessed. Like, obviously it's terrible in some ways, but I do love, there's a certain purity to a kind of like very earnest, well-meaning tech bros just trying to find an app that will fix this. Like, if we could have fixed 2,000 years of messed up patriarchal nonsense with an app, it would exist already, but it's a bit bigger than that. But rules of consent are like, should you ask every time you want to do something new? But the ethic is, and the principle is that women's sexuality is as valid as men's sexuality. And sexuality is not something that women own and control and men have to sort of wheedle out of women, which is still a fundamental assumption of heterosexuality. More and more in the last 30, 40 years of, I know there'll probably be people who cringe when you hear me say neoliberalism, but it means like a culture in which everything is reduced to the logic of the market. Sexuality itself has become something that men are supposed to just acquire, something that men are supposed to get from women within like the deal of heterosexuality. So women are sort of hoarding all the sex, like greedy dragons, and men have to sort of somehow persuade persuade the women to give them little bits of it. And that's just, well, firstly, it's about the least erotic thing I've ever heard, apart from the bit with the dragon, which isn't mandatory. But if you love dragons, so maybe you found a bit more about me than I was intending to on this call. But it's also, it's really depressing. It's not, sex is something you do with other people, not something you can give someone as an object.
I think I'm asking unfairly hard questions here. I mean, it's really hard to establish what an ethics could be. And also I think it's unfair to ask a writer to have an argument, but also know how to implement that argument. I think, that's the world and that's life. I think that's hard. But
I think it's unfair to ask a writer to have any kind of workable political solutions for anything, because if that was what we were best at, we wouldn't be sitting writing theory books. We would be doing other useful things.
I agree. It was unfair of me to ask it. I guess I'm just wondering whether from your position,